At 1:47 on the afternoon of September 27, 1942, Signalman First Class Douglas Munro steered his landing craft directly into Japanese machine gun fire on a beach at Guadalcanal to save 500 Marines who were about to be slaughtered. 22 years old, Coast Guardsman, volunteered for a rescue mission everyone said was suicide. The Marines were trapped. They had advanced inland that morning to attack Japanese positions. The Japanese counterattacked with superior numbers. The Marines retreated to the beach. But the beach was a killing zone. Japanese machine guns on both flanks were firing down the length of the beach. The Marines had no cover. They were pinned in shallow water. Men were dying every second. The only escape was across 400 yards of open water to waiting landing craft. But crossing that water meant exposing themselves to concentrated machine gun fire. The Marine commander radioed for help. He said his men would be wiped out in 15 minutes without evacuation. Doug Munro heard the call. He was commanding a group of 10 landing craft 2 miles offshore. His job was to transport supplies, not conduct combat rescues under fire. But Doug did not hesitate. He radioed his boats. "Follow me. We are going in." Doug's crew told him the Japanese would destroy them. Landing craft had no armor. Machine gun fire would tear through the thin metal hulls. Everyone on board would be killed. Doug said the Marines would die if someone did not help them. He accelerated toward the beach. 9 other landing craft followed. For the next 30 minutes, Doug Munro would execute the most daring rescue in Marine Corps history. He would position his unarmed boat between the Marines and Japanese machine guns. He would use his boat as a shield while other boats loaded Marines. He would draw enemy fire deliberately to save others. By the time the last Marine was evacuated, Doug Munro would be dead, shot through the head while covering the final boat. His last words would be, "Did they get off?" The answer was yes. All 500 Marines survived. Doug Munro was the only Coast Guardsman ever to receive the Medal of Honor. He was 22 years old. He had been in the military for less than 2 years. He was not a combat soldier. He was a boat driver. But he sacrificed himself to save 500 men he had never met. This is the story of how a kid from Washington State became a hero and why almost nobody knows his name. Douglas Albert Munro was born on October 11, 1919, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. His parents were American. His father worked in Canada temporarily. The family moved to Cle-Elum, Washington, when Doug was a child. Doug grew up in small-town Washington. He was popular, athletic, good-looking. He played football. He was senior class president. Everyone liked Doug. He was the kind of person who helped others without being asked. If someone needed something, Doug provided it. That generosity would define his entire life. In 1939, Doug graduated from high school. He did not have money for college. He needed work. Jobs were scarce. The Great Depression was ending, but the economy was still weak. Doug considered his options. He could work locally for low pay, or he could join the military. Doug's best friend, Ray Evans, suggested they join the Coast Guard together. The Coast Guard was smaller than the Army or Navy. Less regimentation. More interesting work. Rescuing people. Saving ships. Doug liked that idea. Helping people appealed to him. In September 1939, Doug and Ray enlisted in the Coast Guard. They went through basic training together. They were assigned to the cutter Spencer. The Spencer patrolled the Atlantic Ocean. The work was routine, search and rescue, boarding merchant ships, iceberg patrol. Doug was good at his job. He learned navigation and seamanship. He was promoted to signalman third class in 1940. He was responsible for communications between ships. Doug and Ray served together on the Spencer for a year. Then Pearl Harbor happened. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II. Suddenly, the Coast Guard was at war. Coast Guard cutters began escorting convoys across the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships. The Coast Guard helped protect them. Doug wanted more direct involvement. He volunteered for transfer to the Pacific. The Navy was forming amphibious forces to invade Japanese-held islands. They needed boat crews. The Coast Guard provided them. In April 1942, Doug was assigned to the 1st Marine Division as part of a boat unit. His job was to transport Marines from ships to beaches during amphibious assaults. Doug had never been in combat. He had no idea what he was about to experience. In August 1942, the 1st Marine Division that was ordered to invade Guadalcanal, a Japanese-held island in the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal had strategic importance. The Japanese were building an airfield there. If completed, Japanese bombers could attack Allied supply lines to Australia. The United States had to take Guadalcanal before the airfield was finished. The invasion was scheduled for August 7th, 1942. Doug's boat unit would land the Marines. On the morning of August 7th, Doug piloted a landing craft loaded with 36 Marines toward the beach at Guadalcanal. This was Doug's first combat operation. He was nervous. Everyone was nervous. They expected heavy Japanese resistance, but when the landing craft hit the beach, there was no resistance. The Japanese had retreated inland. The Marines secured the beach without a fight. Doug returned to his ship, loaded another group of Marines, and made another trip. He made 10 trips that first day. The invasion was a success. The Marines captured the airfield, but the easy part was over. The Japanese counterattacked. For the next 6 months, the Marines and Japanese fought brutal battles across Guadalcanal. The fighting was horrific. Jungle warfare, disease, starvation. The Marines held the airfield, but barely. Doug's job, was to keep the Marines supplied. He transported ammunition, food, water, and reinforcements from ships to the beach. He evacuated wounded Marines from the beach to hospital ships. Doug made dozens of trips every day. He worked 16-hour days. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Japanese aircraft bombed the ships regularly. Doug's landing craft was strafed multiple times. But Doug never complained. He just did his job. The Marines noticed Doug. He was always there. When they needed supplies, Doug brought them. When they needed evacuation, Doug came to get them. The Marines trusted Doug. They knew he would not abandon them. In September 1942, Doug was promoted to signalman first class. He was also given command of a group of 10 landing craft. Doug was now responsible for coordinating boat operations. He was 22 years old and in charge of 50 men. Doug took the responsibility seriously. He trained his crews. He maintained the boats. He planned operations carefully. Doug's commanding officer said Doug was the best boat commander in the Pacific. On September 27, 1942, the Marines launched an offensive to expand the perimeter around the airfield. A force of 500 Marines from the 7th Marines advanced west along the coast. Their objective was to clear Japanese forces from a ridge overlooking the airfield. The Marines advanced inland. They encountered heavy Japanese resistance. The Japanese had fortified positions on the ridge. The Marines attacked but were repelled. Then the Japanese counterattacked with superior numbers. The Marines were forced to retreat. They fell back to the beach. But the Japanese pursued them. By 1:00 p.m., the Marines were trapped on the beach with Japanese forces closing in from inland and Japanese machine guns firing from both flanks. The beach was a killing zone. Marines were exposed. They had no cover. Wounded men lay in the shallow water. The living tried to shield themselves behind the dead. The Marine commander, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller, radioed for help. He said his battalion was about to be overrun. He needed immediate evacuation. Without boats, his men would be wiped out. The call went out to all available landing craft. Doug Munro heard it. He was 2 miles offshore with his group of 10 landing craft. They had just finished unloading supplies. Doug's crew heard the call. They knew what it meant. Going to that beach meant sailing into concentrated enemy fire. Landing craft had no armor. They were basically metal boxes with engines. Machine gun fire would punch through the hulls. Everyone on board would be exposed. Doug's second-in-command, Samuel Roberts, said they should wait for air support or artillery. Going in without cover was suicide. Doug said the Marines did not have time. They needed help now. Doug radioed his other boats. "Follow me. We are going in to get the Marines." Doug's boats formed up and headed toward the beach at full speed. As they approached, they could see the situation. The beach was under heavy fire. Japanese machine guns were firing from positions on both flanks. The Marines were pinned in the shallow water. Bodies floated in the surf. Doug assessed the situation quickly. The landing craft could not approach the beach directly. The Japanese machine guns would destroy them. Doug needed a different approach. He decided to use his boat as a shield. Doug positioned his landing craft between the Marines and the Japanese machine gun positions on the left flank. His boat absorbed the fire meant for the Marines. Bullets struck Doug's boat. They punched through the metal hull. Doug's crew ducked behind the gunwales. Doug remained standing at the helm, exposed, steering the boat. He radioed the other landing craft. "Move in now, load the Marines. I will cover you." The other landing craft raced to the beach. They dropped their ramps. Marines waded through the water and climbed aboard. The loading was chaotic. Wounded men had to be carried. Some Marines were too injured to move. Others dragged them to the boats. The Japanese machine guns kept firing. Doug's boat continued to shield the Marines. Bullets hit Doug's boat constantly. His crew was terrified, but they stayed at their positions. Doug remained standing, steering, absorbing fire. The first boats loaded and pulled away from the beach. They were packed with Marines. More boats moved in. Doug repositioned his boat to shield them. He was deliberately drawing enemy fire away from the evacuation. The Japanese realized what Doug was doing. They concentrated fire on his boat. The volume of fire increased. Doug's boat was being hit dozens of times per minute. One of Doug's crew members was wounded. Doug ordered him to take cover below. The man refused. He stayed at his position. More boats loaded and pulled away. The evacuation was working, but it was taking too long. The Marines were loading slowly because they had wounded. Doug radioed Lieutenant Colonel Puller. "We will stay until everyone is off. Do not worry." Puller later said those words saved his battalion. Knowing the boats would not leave gave the Marines hope. They kept moving to the boats. They helped the wounded. They stayed organized. By 2:15 p.m., most of the Marines had been evacuated. Only about 50 remained on the beach. Doug's boat was badly damaged. The hull had multiple holes. Water was leaking in. The engine was hit but still running. Doug's crew was pumping water out to keep the boat afloat. Doug radioed the last boats. "Load the remaining Marines and get out. I will cover your withdrawal." The final boats moved to the beach. The last Marines climbed aboard. Lieutenant Colonel Puller was among them. As Puller's boat pulled away from the beach, he looked back at Doug's boat. Doug was still positioned between the Japanese and the evacuation, still absorbing fire, still protecting the Marines. At 2:27 p.m., a Japanese machine gun burst hit Doug Munro. 3 bullets struck him. One went through his neck, another through his chest, the third through his head. Doug collapsed at the helm. His coxswain, Ray Evans, Doug's best friend from high school, caught him. Ray laid Doug on the deck. Blood was everywhere. Ray tried to stop the bleeding. He knew it was hopeless. Doug was dying. Doug looked at Ray. He tried to speak. Ray leaned close to hear. Doug's last words were, "Did they get off?" Ray said yes. All the Marines were off the beach. Doug smiled slightly. Then he died. Ray Evans later said those were the most important words Doug ever spoke. In his final moments, Doug was not thinking about himself. He was thinking about the Marines. Ray took control of the boat. He steered away from the beach. Doug's boat was sinking. Water was pouring through the holes in the hull. Ray radioed for help. Another boat came alongside. Ray and the crew transferred Doug's body to the other boat. Then they abandoned Doug's boat. It sank 10 minutes later. Ray Evans brought Doug's body back to the ship. The Marines who had been evacuated lined the deck. They removed their helmets as Doug's body was brought aboard. Many were crying. They knew Doug had died saving them. Lieutenant Colonel Puller reported the rescue to division headquarters. He said Doug Munro had saved 500 Marines through extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Puller recommended Doug for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was approved. On May 24, 1943, Doug's parents, James and Edith Munro, attended a ceremony at the Coast Guard headquarters in Seattle. President Roosevelt had authorized the Medal of Honor. The Commandant of the Coast Guard presented the medal to Doug's parents. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty as officer in charge of a group of landing craft engaged in the evacuation of a battalion of Marines trapped by enemy forces at Point Cruz, Guadalcanal, on September 27, 1942. After making preliminary plans for the evacuation, Signalman First Class Munro, under constant strafing by enemy machine guns on the island, and at great risk of his own life, daringly led 5 of his small craft toward the shore. As he closed the beach, he signaled the others to land, and then, in order to draw the enemy's fire and protect the heavily loaded boats, he valiantly placed his craft, with its 2 small guns, as a shield between the beachhead and the Japanese. When the perilous task of evacuation was nearly completed, Signalman First Class Munro was killed by enemy fire, but his crew, 2 of whom were wounded, carried on until the last boat had loaded and cleared the beach. By his outstanding leadership, expert planning, and dauntless devotion to duty, he and his courageous comrades undoubtedly saved the lives of many who otherwise would have perished. He gallantly gave his life for his country. If you want to see why Doug Munro's sacrifice is almost forgotten, and how his story eventually inspired the entire Coast Guard, hit that like button. It helps us share these unknown heroes with the world. Subscribe if you have not already. We bring you the warrior's history, forgot every single day. Back to Doug. After the ceremony, Doug's parents returned to Cle Elum, Washington. They were devastated. Doug was their only son. They had received news of his death in October 1942, 1 month after it happened. The news destroyed them. Edith Munro never recovered. She spent the rest of her life mourning Doug. She kept his Medal of Honor in a box. She rarely looked at it. The medal reminded her that Doug was gone. James Monroe tried to honor Doug's memory. He spoke at schools and veteran events about Doug's sacrifice. He told young people about courage and duty. But James struggled with grief. He died in 1955 at age 64. Heart failure. Friends said James died of a broken heart. Ray Evans, Doug's best friend and coxswain, returned to the United States in 1943. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the evacuation. Ray had continued commanding the boat after Doug was killed. He had completed the mission. Ray left the Coast Guard after the war. He never spoke about Doug. The memories were too painful. Ray died in 2004 at age 83. Before he died, Ray gave an interview to a Coast Guard historian. Ray said Doug was the bravest person he ever knew. Ray said Doug did not think about the danger. He only thought about saving the Marines. Ray also said Doug's last words haunted him. Did they get off? Ray said those words captured everything about Doug. Even dying, Doug was worried about others. The 500 Marines Doug saved went on to fight across the Pacific. Many survived the war. They had families, children, grandchildren. Today, thousands of people exist because Doug Munro saved their grandfathers or great-grandfathers. But most of those descendants do not know Doug's name. The Marines knew. Every Marine who was on that beach on September 27, 1942, remembered Doug Munro. They told their families. They told their friends. In Marine Corps culture, Doug Munro became a legend, the Coast Guardsman who died saving Marines. In 1948, the Coast Guard named a cutter after Doug, the WWII Munro. The ship served for 40 years. It conducted search and rescue operations, law enforcement, and Vietnam War patrols. The Munro was decommissioned in 1988. But the Coast Guard immediately commissioned a new cutter with the same name. The second USCGC Munro is a Legend-class cutter, one of the most advanced ships in the Coast Guard fleet. It patrols the Pacific Ocean, conducting the same missions Doug conducted, saving lives. The Coast Guard also established the Munro Award, given annually to the Coast Guard member who demonstrates extraordinary heroism. But outside the Coast Guard and Marine Corps, Doug Munro remained unknown. The general public had never heard of him. World War II history focused on famous battles and famous generals. Doug's story was footnote in history books. A single paragraph. Most Americans could name Medal of Honor recipients like Audie Murphy or Alvin York. Almost no one knew Doug Munro. In 2000, a Coast Guard officer named Scott Price decided to change that. Price was frustrated that Doug's story was forgotten. Price began researching Doug's life. He interviewed Ray Evans. He found Doug's high school classmates. He collected photographs and documents. Price wrote articles about Doug. He gave presentations at schools and veteran organizations. Price also lobbied for a memorial. In 2002, the Coast Guard dedicated a statue of Doug Munro at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. The statue depicts Doug at the helm of his landing craft, steering toward danger. The dedication ceremony was attended by Doug's extended family, Coast Guard leadership, and several Marines who had been rescued by Doug 60 years earlier. The Marines were now in their 80s. They stood before the statue and saluted. Several cried. They said they had waited 60 years to thank Doug properly. In 2004, the book Guardian of Guadalcanal by Gary Williams was published. The book told Doug's complete story. It became required reading at Coast Guard boot camp. Every Coast Guard recruit learns about Doug Munro. He is held up as the example of what it means to be a Coast Guardsman. Selfless service. In 2013, the Coast Guard Training Center in Cape May, New Jersey, renamed its main training building Munro Hall. New recruits pass through Munro Hall every day. They see Doug's photo. They read his story. They learn about sacrifice. The Coast Guard motto is Semper Paratus, always ready. Doug Munro exemplified that motto. He was ready when the Marines needed him. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for orders. He saw people who needed help, and he helped them. That is the essence of the Coast Guard. In 2019, on the 100th anniversary of Doug's birth, the Coast Guard held ceremonies across the country honoring him. The Commandant of the Coast Guard gave a speech. He said Doug represented the best of the service: courage, competence, and concern for others. The Commandant also said Doug's sacrifice ensured that 500 Marines went home to their families. Those Marines had children. Those children had children. Today, thousands of people owe their existence to Doug Munro. That is legacy. Why is Doug Munro's story not more widely known? Several reasons. First, Doug was Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is the smallest military service. It gets less attention than Army, Navy, or Marines. Second, Doug was not a combat soldier. He was a boat driver. His heroism does not fit the traditional warrior narrative. Third, Doug's action was a rescue, not an attack. Americans celebrate warriors who kill enemies. We pay less attention to warriors who save friends. But Doug's heroism is equal to any Medal of Honor recipient. He deliberately placed himself in the line of fire to protect others. He died so they could live. That is the definition of sacrifice. Doug Munro's story also challenges assumptions about heroism. Heroes are not always soldiers. Doug was essentially a taxi driver. His job was transporting people. But when those people needed saving, Doug saved them. He used his boat as a weapon, not to attack enemies, but to shield friends. That creativity and selflessness are what made Doug a hero. Doug was also young. He was 22 when he died. He had barely lived. He had no wife, no children. His entire future was ahead of him. He gave it all up for people he did not know. That sacrifice is almost incomprehensible. Most people would hesitate. Doug did not hesitate. He saw a problem and solved it. The cost was his life. He paid it without complaint. Doug's last words reveal his character. Did they get off? Not, am I going to live? Not, tell my parents I love them. Doug's final thought was about the mission, about the Marines. That selflessness defines greatness. Today, Doug Munro's story is taught at every military service academy: West Point, Annapolis, Air Force Academy, Coast Guard Academy. Cadets study Doug's decision-making. How did he assess the situation so quickly? How did he devise a plan in seconds? How did he convince his crew to follow him into suicidal danger? The answer is leadership. Doug led by example. He did not order his crew to risk their lives. He risked his own life first. When his crew saw Doug standing at the helm absorbing fire, they could not do less. Doug inspired courage through his own courage. Modern Coast Guard operations are built on Doug's example. Search and rescue missions, hurricane evacuations. Saving people is the Coast Guard's primary mission. Doug proved that saving lives requires the same courage as taking lives. Running toward danger to save others is heroism. The Coast Guard embraces that mission because of Doug Munro. The Marines also honor Doug. Every Marine learns about Doug in training. He is one of the few non-Marines that Marines claim as their own. The Marines say Doug earned the title Marine through his sacrifice. There is no higher honor. In 2020, the Marine Corps dedicated a training facility at Camp Pendleton as Munro Hall. Marine recruits train in a building named after the Coast Guardsmen who died saving Marines. The symbolism is powerful. The services honor each other. They recognize that heroism transcends branch rivalry. Doug Munro's legacy is that courage is not about attacking. It is about protecting. Doug killed no enemies. He destroyed no enemy equipment. But he saved 500 lives. Those lives had value. They had families. They had futures. Doug gave those men their futures by sacrificing his own. That is heroism in its purest form. Doug's story also reminds us that heroes are ordinary people. Doug was not a superhuman warrior. He was a kid from Washington who wanted to help people. He joined the Coast Guard to save lives. He did exactly that. He saved 500 lives in one day. Then he died. No fanfare. No expectation of recognition. Doug did what he believed was right. The Medal of Honor came later. Doug did not do it for medals. He did it because people needed help. What can we learn from Doug Munro? First, heroism is a choice. Doug chose to sail into enemy fire. He could have waited. He could have called for air support. He chose immediate action. That choice saved lives. Second, leadership is about sacrifice. Doug did not send his crew into danger. He led them into danger. He took the most dangerous position himself. That is leadership. Third, selflessness is the highest virtue. Doug's last words were about others, not himself. He died worrying about the Marines, not about his own death. That selflessness is rare and precious. Doug Munro died 82 years ago. Most people alive today were not born when Doug died. His story should be forgotten by now. But it is not. The Coast Guard keeps his memory alive. The Marines keep his memory alive. Every year, new generations learn about the 22-year-old boat driver who became a hero. Doug's parents received his Medal of Honor. They kept it until they died. The medal was donated to the Coast Guard Museum. It is displayed with Doug's uniform and photographs. Visitors see the medal and read Doug's story. Many cry. They cannot believe a 22-year-old sacrificed himself for strangers. But Doug did. He saw people in danger and he saved them. It cost him everything. He paid the price without hesitation. That is why Doug Munro deserves to be remembered. Not because he was the strongest or the smartest, because he was willing to die for others. That willingness, that selflessness, that courage defines the best of humanity. Doug Munro represents the best of us. A young man who gave everything so others could live. His story deserves to be told. His sacrifice deserves to be honored. He deserves to be remembered. The 500 Marines Doug saved never forgot him. They told their children about the Coast Guardsmen who died so they could live. Those children told their children. The story passes down through generations. As long as those families exist, Doug Munro will be remembered. And that is enough. Heroes do not need monuments or fame. They need to be remembered by the people they saved. Doug has that. His memory lives in the families of 500 Marines. That is immortality. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share forgotten heroes like Doug Munro. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. United States? Canada? United Kingdom? Australia? Our community is global. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us what you think about Doug Munro's sacrifice. We read every single comment. Thank you for watching. Thank you for helping us preserve the memory of heroes like Doug Munro, the Coast Guardsman who became a Marine legend by giving his life for 500 strangers. We will see you in the next one.